Hi, I'm BJ Arun. I'm on the board of Thai Silicon Valley, and I'm also the chair of charter memberships. So just like a little note about charter membership. Charter membership is by invitation. We recognize entrepreneurs as well as execs who have excelled in their respective fields. And so we have a little under 300 charter members in the Silicon Valley chapter. And every chapter have their own charter members, but we have a little under 300 in our chapter. And so, so the idea of charter membership is for these successful business leaders to actually mentor up and coming entrepreneurs. So that's the whole idea behind Thai, and so that's what charter membership is about. And so when we do get charter members to accept our invitation, we also ensure that they understand what it's about and that they need to give back in terms of time. My story, again, as the title itself says, is about the story of entrepreneurs who have gone through the whole process of building, scaling, and exiting companies. And most of us are entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs. That's why we belong to Thai or come to these things. And so I think it's important for us to learn from fellow entrepreneurs who have gone through the journey. And it's also a great opportunity to celebrate their success and their exit. So this evening's story is Thejo Kote, goes by Thejo. And I know Thejo for a few years now. We actually have a common investor. So I met him at one of the events there. And being sort of a fellow Indian and also being from the same state, Karnataka, which I'm from, we got talking. Became friends. A few years ago in 2014, he got married. I was there in Bangalore, so I had an opportunity to give him, participate in his wedding, which is pretty unique. Most of us, don't get to do that for people we have just met. And, Thejo has been a friend, and from time to time, we'd chat and he'd get some inputs, etc. And it's been very heartening to see how he has scaled and exited his company in a very short period of time. From the little blurb that I sent out, we probably have seen, Thejo came to the US only in 2009. And so he came to Berkeley in 2009. He graduated in 2011. So in just the span of 6 years, he has built, scaled, and exited a company for $115 million. His company, Automatic, he was acquired by SiriusXM, the satellite company. And so it's a pretty fascinating story, and I think we're in for a treat this evening. So I don't want to spill more of this. I think at this point I'd like to invite Thejo to the stage, and let's hear from Thejo. So a round of applause for Thejo Kote.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you. I'm going to use this. All right, so is this on? Excellent. Thank you. So, BJ, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today, and thanks to Thai Silicon Valley for giving me this opportunity to tell my story, and thanks Deepti for making all of this happen, and finally SVB. So we were a SVB customer at Automatic. I'm a customer now, and long time SVB customer. So thank you for making this venue available. And when I was invited to come and speak, I asked Deepti, okay, what would help the audience, and she basically told me, look at the title. What does it say? No, I'm joking. She was nicer about that. But what I will focus on a little bit more is the earlier part of my story, is because the latter part I think might not be as relevant or useful to the people who are thinking about starting up. And I think one of the goals of this whole series is to help people who are thinking about starting your own companies, and what that experience is like. And so I will try and kind of talk about that a little bit more, right? So now, going all the way back, I am, like BJ mentioned, from the state of Karnataka. I was born in a place called Mysore in South India. And I was born there. I grew up there. I lived there till I was about 18 years old, and then I moved to Bangalore, which is close to Mysore. And it seems to me like most of you are from India, but for those of you who aren't, Mysore is this sleepy little town of 1 million people in India, right? Like that's the nature of how things go in India. A town of 1 million people is not considered to be that large, right? And as I was growing up, it was a very middle class kind of upbringing, and it is only now that I look back and recognize a lot of the things that in terms of my mother especially, because she was pretty much a single parent, because my father was away working far away, and it was mainly my mother who was taking care of my brother and me, and I had a grandfather. It is only now when I look back on my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation that I realize a lot of the sacrifices that they had to make to kind of give us that really normal middle class life, right? And I will give you a little bit of context on that, because that did in the future influence my thinking and decision making as I decided, okay, do I want to become an entrepreneur, and really influenced my thinking around that, right? And for example, my grandfather was somebody who came abject poverty, right? Like, and that is a generous way of putting it. And he was the kind of guy who was intelligent, but didn't really have those opportunities in life. And when he was like a 14, 15-year-old kid, he really wanted to study, but didn't really have the means to. And he used to go to school for a year and then drop out, work for a year so that he could collect the fees for the next year, and then he would just go back to school and then do that, drop out again. So finally, by the time he was like 20 or 21, he finished his 10th grade, and then, but hey, there were like 4 or 5 people, behind him in terms of siblings, and he had to take care of them. And so he never really got to kind of pursue his true passion in life, which was literature, but he found a way to do that, right? And he had this insane work ethic, which I never appreciated back then, because back then he was, my grandfather, right? And I didn't really appreciate or imbibe or learn from what I was seeing from him. And the grandfather that I remember was in his early 70s, late 70s, and even at that age, he had like a work ethic which was like 3 times better than the one that I have today, right? And so and this was the person that I grew up around, and it was their hard work over a couple of generations which kind of really made my life, and my brothers who's 4 years older than me, it made our life much easier and very uneventful, I would guess, right? And so, but also life in Mysore as I was growing up, my mother was very adamant about making sure that we always went to the best schools, and education was incredibly important. And I came from a very academic family, right? And so we had a library of 3,500 books at home, and always around books. And so that was kind of the environment that I grew up in. And also it was pretty easy, right, in terms of school, and I didn't really have to work that hard. I never remember cracking a book open 2 days before the exam, right? That was the routine. And that was what life was largely till I was about 18 years old. And of course, as is typical in Indian families, as I got to the stage where I had to make that choice, right? You either want to become an engineer or a doctor, and I was really sure I didn't want to become a doctor, but I was somebody who was very interested in the engineering side of things, right? And how do things work, electronics, and more deeply understanding just how the things around me just work. And that was something that I really wanted to do. And I kind of made that choice easier for myself, where, without telling anybody, in my 11th grade, I dropped biology and I took electronics as a subject, so that wouldn't even be a discussion, right? And so thankfully I just then got to pursue my passion. And for everybody also who comes from India, how big at that age the whole thing about IIT is, right? Like, all parents want you to get into the IITs. They want you to, go study in the IITs. But I never had the, work ethic to really put in the preparation required to kind of, pass the JEE, which is, as you all know, an incredibly competitive exam. And I went through the motions of going to some coaching classes in Mysore, and eventually, I think I got some dismal rank, and that really wasn't an option. But I still was able to go to a pretty good school in Bangalore. It was called RV College of Engineering, for those who are familiar with engineering colleges in Bangalore. But I went there. I studied electrical engineering, and partly because it was interesting to me, but it was more about, my brother had studied electrical engineering, my uncle was an electrical engineer, my aunt was an electrical engineer. Like, hey, there's so many electrical engineers. Worst case, I'll get lots of free textbooks, right? So that was the motivation, and so I went through. I think a common theme you might be getting out of what I've been saying is that life until that point was mainly just coasting along, right? So I was just being guided and led through a path which was kind of the right thing to do, and I was just going through the motions, and I was never really pushed very hard or challenged very hard throughout this process. And of course, as I kind of went into the undergraduate degree program, and I was going through that is when, of course, the people around me were a lot smarter, and where I was very easily at the top of the class in earlier years, things really began to change when I went into engineering, right? I don't think maybe I was in the top third or something like that, and I slowly started realizing that, and and that kind of started bothering me, right? And the really big, I guess, kick in the butt that I got was in the third year of my engineering. And again, for those of you who are from India, that there is a whole campus recruitment that happens in India in the third year, and then you have one more year left. And it was during that time that all of my kind of the companies that I looked up to, right, the Googles, the Yahoos, and Yahoo was the company that everybody looked up to back then. This is in 2003, and Microsoft and all of these companies came for campus recruitment, and not a single one of them would even give me an interview, right? And the nature of it was that they were pretty adamant about the fact that they only wanted computer science students, right? Like, that was what they were looking for, and they were not interested in electrical engineering students. And that was an important first wake-up call for me, in that until that point, at least over the last few years before that, I had really built up a passion for technology and technology companies, and I really looked up to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, and just not because I had any longer term ambitions, but I was somehow naturally drawn to that, right? And one of the things that the reasons why I was more attracted towards engineering as a profession was that I could see, and it was my kind of hypothesis, that as an engineer, you kind of have the opportunity to influence a lot of people in a good way compared to many other professions, right? Being a doctor is an amazing thing, but I feel like in the most common way that it is practiced, a limitation is that the number of people that you get to have a positive impact on is somehow constrained by the number of people you can actually interact with and touch and treat and all of that, right? So, over the course of a career, the number of people that you can have a positive impact on is somewhat bounded, right? But, with engineering, what was really attractive to me was, if you got really lucky, you could, sit at home behind a computer, write a piece of software, and literally billions of people could be using it, and it could have a positive impact on their lives, right? And so that whole notion of leverage, of being able to do some work and then have lots of people positively benefit from it, as a concept was really interesting to me, right? So once I kind of understood that, I started looking into, you know, how companies actually have that impact. All of the popular companies that we know and like and use products from, right? Like how were they founded, and what do they do, and the founder stories of those companies. And so all of that was really interesting to me, and I was kind of lapping that up, and it was just I've always since that stage been a student of technology history, right? And I feel like there is always a lot you can learn from the good and the bad, the positive things and the mistakes that people who have come before us have done. And so I've always kind of enjoyed reading and learning about that, and I had been doing that. And so in the backdrop of all of that, having these companies that I really looked up to basically come and say, you're not even good enough to come interview at our company was an interesting wake-up call for me, right? And that was when I for the first time looked around and I said, like, what exactly am I doing with my life? Like, what is it that I actually want to do? And that was when I finally started asking myself those questions. And as I was trying to find answers to those questions, I ended up taking a job at Infosys, right? And because I had heard that, hey, they have a fantastic training program, right? And so it's like, the 9th semester, 6 months after you graduate, you just go and they will train you and you will learn a bunch of things about computer science that I didn't really have a strong grounding in because I had studied electrical engineering. I'm like, okay, seems like a worthwhile thing to go do. And so I did, right? And, that only kind of deepened my desire to kind of, go do something else, because there is a very specific thing that I remember about how I started on this journey to kind of being an entrepreneur, right? So this training that Infosys provided happened in their campus in Mysore, right? And so they have like I think it's the world's largest corporate training campus or something like that, and it's fantastic, beautiful, right? And all of the amenities you could dream of, and but it's also pretty much like a large college campus in that you have all the buildings where you study and all the classes happen, but then all the students stay on campus. There are hostels, and you stay there. And still during the first week of that program, where we were just getting used to the program, and it was pretty intensive. 10, 12 hours a day was common, and I remember one morning, me and my roommate, we set out. It was 8 o'clock or 8:30 in the morning. The first class was about to start or whatever, and there was this requirement of formal clothing. You had to kind of wear formal clothes, tie, all of that, right? And so we were all decked up and we were going, and the hostel was kind of on a slightly higher plane of ground, and we were walking towards the building, and I just looked up and I saw this sea of humanity, right? Like this, long, hundreds and hundreds of people who are walking to that class, and it was like the drone army, right? It was like everybody wearing very similar formal clothes, and I was like, that was the moment that never goes out of my head, because I looked at that and I went, okay, this is going to be my life for, I don't know, the next 50 years, 60 years. Like, is that what I truly deeply want? And that was also the moment when I kind of really understood what defining happiness for yourself truly means, right? Because there really aren't right or wrong answers, right? Everybody has their own definition of happiness, but that was when I asked myself, like, what's mine, right? Like, clearly it seems to me like this is not what I want, and what is it that I truly want? And because the experience at Infosys later also was for me, I looked at all of the other people and say, okay, 2 years from now I'm going to be that person, 4 years that person, 8 years that person. None of that seemed appealing to me, right? I didn't feel like I would personally be happy by doing that for as a career, to make a career out of it. And so that was when the fire was well and truly lit under me. Like the coasting part of, I think, my life was pretty much done at that point, because I asked myself, what is it that will truly make me happy, right? Like, what is that thing where I will just wake up every morning and I will be happy to go do that work, right? And so, that is what I should be doing. And so I went back to the thing that was my passion, and then the things that I was doing on the side anyway, right? And so I decided, okay, I really should pursue my dream of creating new products, and entrepreneurship is a possible path to doing that, right? And so I was like, great, I'm going to do that, right? And the very next thought in my head was, great, idiot, but you know nothing about nothing, right? Like, you don't know anything, you don't really have any skills. And so that became the big focus, which was like, just go learn as much as possible. And I started doing that, right? And at Infosys, as I was doing that job, I was there for about a year. And I remember during that process, this was like, I came back to Bangalore after the training, and I lived pretty far away, and I used to leave at about 6:30 in the morning, and then terrible traffic. By the time I got home in the evening, it used to be 7:30, and but I still used to work on my own side projects. I was building stuff because that was how, and I was particularly fascinated by the internet, right? Because I felt like this is this completely game-changing technology that is going to kind of change everything about our lives, right? And so I wanted to learn everything about it. I wanted to find out how to build for it. How do you build applications for it? And I started doing that, right? And one of the things I ended up doing was I picked projects that I felt my work at Infosys could benefit from also, right? Like, and that turned out to be a good idea because all of my managers at Infosys were like, oh, this guy takes so much initiative, right? Like, he is awesome. But my whole goal was to get my skills up to a point where I could just leave, right? And so, but that worked. And I was, every day I used to come back home, from about 8:30 till about 1 a.m. in the morning, 2 a.m. in the morning. I used to kind of sit and build my own stuff, and I learned lots of really interesting things, and it was not easy, but it was very fulfilling, right? And I really enjoyed that process. And I also remember, one of the things that I will always value from that experience of my first job was just how inspirational, at least I found the founders of Infosys to be, right? Like, that was one of those amazing success stories of entrepreneurship in India. And I remember when I was there, Nandan Nilekani was the CEO. And so I remember every quarter when they announced the results, every employee was welcome to go sit in the media center and listen to the leaders of Infosys talk about the company, right? Like, what happened the last quarter, what's coming, the health of the business, all of those things. And unfortunately, pretty much nobody took advantage of that. But, I very religiously, marked that in my calendar, and I used to go sit in that media center just waiting for Nandan to come and speak, right? Because, he was extremely inspirational. Like, he just used to come in and just extempore, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just talk about Infosys, the state of the business, past, present, like what's going well, what's not going well. And I just found that extremely interesting. Maybe that's just too geeky or whatever, but I look forward to that, right? And I did that the entire year and a couple of months that I was there. And ultimately, as I was building these projects, I ended up, one of those projects was something, it was a news aggregation service, right? Something pretty simple. And, I built it as a replacement to another tool I was using. It was called samachar.com, like, for those of you who remember. And it was, samachar.com was a news aggregation website. I built something that I felt wasn't as spammy and full of ads and all of that. And, it was one of my side projects. And, in a very cocky way, I sent an email to the founder of samachar.com, and his name is Rajesh Jain. He was one of the original successful entrepreneurs in India, right? So in the late 90s, he sold his India World group of the portal essentially to SIFI, and that was the biggest exit of the time in India. And even at that time, this was in 2005 or early 2006, he was the most successful tech entrepreneur to build a product out of India. And so he used to blog, and I used to read it. And so I essentially sent him an email and said, hey, look, I've built this thing. It is better than your thing, right? And so, I was like this, naive, 23-year-old, essentially. And he very, nicely got back to me, and he said, this is great. Like, what are you doing, and where are you? And, tell me more about yourself. And so I did. Then he told me, look, I'm starting a new venture, right? And, it's very early stage now. I just have one person in Bangalore, and do you want to come work with us? Just go meet my VP of engineering. We just hired him. We brought him from Silicon Valley and all that. And, go talk to him. I was like, great, I'll talk to him, right? And so I went and met him, spent some time with him, and it was barely an interview, but they offered me a job. And, that was, I felt like that was my break, right? Because what I was looking for was the experience of going and building my own company at some point. And I knew that there was so much I had to learn to do that. And this seemed like a great opportunity to go work with, a founder who had success before. And so I jumped in, right? And of course, there were the inevitable questions of, you're leaving a brand name and going and working in some no-name startup. And, but I was fine with that. And my brother was helpful in kind of convincing, my mother that, no, this is fine, like, you should just go do it. And so I did. And, I had the time of my life, essentially, right? It was a fantastic experience, but lots of ups and downs there too. And that was part of the lesson of what it's like, being in a startup. And, within 6 months of being in that, startup, I realized that the whole thesis for that company was flawed, right? And that essentially depended on, the 100 million people who had mobile phones in India back then having access to data connectivity, right? The whole thesis was we're going to build a portal, but for mobile phones. And, that's going to be a big opportunity. But unfortunately, nobody had access to data connections and phones. And, then I was like, damn, like, I just made this big shift, and this company is going to die now, right? And so I just kept building things on the side. And my whole thesis became, okay, how do I reach all 100 million people? It has to be voice or text messaging, right? Like, that is the only thing that you can use to reach everybody. And so I started building a number of different applications, and I started throwing them over the wall at the management of the company, right? And the CTO somehow took a liking to me, and she was my champion in taking those side projects of mine. And ultimately, we convinced Rajesh to kind of back one of those projects, which was kind of a mix of Twitter and Yahoo groups, but on SMS, right? It's kind of a social messaging kind of a product. And to his credit, he saw the potential of that. Said, let's go launch this, and it took off, right? And it was doing really well, for the longest time. And then the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India came in and passed some laws, and finally, it died in 2011, like years later. But at the time, it was growing incredibly fast, and the company kind of pivoted the attention to kind of that product. And this was my baby, and it was a fantastic experience for me to watch that team grow from like 6 or 7 people. Ultimately when I left, it was 70 or 80 people or something like that. And so I sucked it all up like a sponge, right? It was a fascinating experience for me to really be a part of something that didn't exist, but then built it and then saw it grow into something really meaningful. And so I really had fun doing that. But along the process of building that company, a similar product and company was being built here in Silicon Valley, right? And that product is called Twitter. And funnily enough, Twitter had launched like 2 weeks before we launched that product in India. So it was a fantastic case study for us to see how we were doing against them, right? And long story short, they kicked our butt, and they were doing much better than us at every stage of growth, right? And so that was a chance for me to kind of introspect and ask myself, like, why is that? Right? And it was a very similar idea. We had, in the early days, we had initial growth rates, and we had millions of users, they had millions of users, all of that. But eventually, they handily beat us. And I thought long and hard about, like, why exactly is that? And I came up with a couple of reasons, which essentially boiled down to one: location, right? And they were here in Silicon Valley, and they were launching products in Mike Arrington's backyard, and he was the founder of TechCrunch, and he was writing about them all the time. And they were going to South by Southwest, and they blew up over there, and they had access to a lot of the best talent. And so I felt like location really mattered, and that was something I took away from that experience. And the other thing was just pure execution, right? And all of you must have heard the adage about how ideas are a dime a dozen, but it's all about execution, right? And that was the experience that really drove that home for me, because purely from an execution perspective, be it product management or user experience or design or whatever you want to kind of put under the bucket that goes into overall execution, they were doing better than us, right? And so I was like, if I were to be introspective, I had a lot of those blind spots myself, right? Like, I was kind of this engineer who looked at the world in black or white, and I had huge blind spots in terms of my own skills when it came to building better products and user experience and things like that. So I decided, that is something I should try and address, right? Like, how do I, if my goal really is to build world-class products and kind of have a positive impact on as many people as possible through the products that I build, then I can't have such big blind spots in my skills, right? So, that kind of convinced me that, look, I need to move on. I had learned, I felt everything I could in that company that I was working for. And, also, of course, I owned 0.000, I forget how many zeros there were in terms of equity that I owned in the company, right? And so it didn't really make sense for me to stick around more than 4 years or something like that I was there. And I started kind of, I decided, okay, I need to be here in Silicon Valley, right? And as you know, it's not as simple as buying a ticket and coming here, right? And but there was this opportunity for me to address both of those things that I had identified. I could kind of come here and I could study, right? I could study the things that I felt I wasn't really good at. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to come to Silicon Valley, and the only two universities that really matter in the Bay Area, Stanford, Berkeley, I'm going to go to one of those places, right? And then, of course, reality set in when a bunch of people, I spoke to people who had been here, done that and all that, and they were like, yeah, it's not as easy as you think it is, right? But I was still like, okay, I'm either going to those two places or not at all, because I don't want to just be in the US and be in some other place, because I know this is what I want to be doing. And finally, I applied, and I applied to these two places, but to stop my mother from, I won't use the word nag, but that is pretty much what she was doing. But to stop her from really doing that, I applied to a couple of more places also. And surprisingly enough, I got into this program in Berkeley that I felt was a perfect fit for what I was looking for, right? It was called the School of Information, and it was this interdisciplinary place where I could go and study human-computer interaction and user experience design and, the legal aspects of privacy. It is like a really good program that I had a lot of fun being a part of. And so I got to come here, and so I did, right? And it was a fascinating experience because, Berkeley is obviously full of really smart people. And just the promise I made myself was just soak it in, right? Again, just learn as much as I could, and meet as many smart people as possible. And by that time, I had also kind of figured out that the best way for self-improvement in life is to make sure that you're constantly surrounding yourself with people who are much smarter than you, right? Like, that's how you kind of up your game, and that is how you become a lot better than you were previously. Because I've always had this innate competitive streak in that, like, I don't want to be kind of the dumbest guy in the room, right? Like, but I try to surround myself with people much smarter than me, and then I try to work myself up to their level as much as possible, and that helps with self-improvement. And so Berkeley was again that way. It was kind of a step up, and incredibly smart people in a very wide variety of areas that I got to interact with and learn from. And it was also fascinating for me to just be here in the Bay Area. And when I was still in Bangalore, I was reading so much about what was happening here that it was fantastic to finally be here, right? And I had totally drunk the Kool-Aid in terms of reading all of Paul Graham's essays and the multiple times, and maybe a little too much. But I even remember, for example, when I was still a student in engineering, right? There was a big Apple launch event. I think this was in 2002 or 2003. They were launching the iPod Nano or something like that. I remember keeping an alarm for like 1:30 a.m. in the morning just so that I could read like what exactly was in that iPod Nano. And I never owned an iPod in my life, right? Like I have no idea why I did that, but it was something that I was just naturally attracted to, and it was great to finally be here and be a part of that ecosystem, and I made full use of that opportunity, right? And so I went to a lot of the events and tried to meet as many people as possible, and in the summer between my first and second year, I had a number of opportunities to go do really interesting things. A small side note is that I could have been, I think, employee number 4 or 5 at Twilio, right? And given the work that I had done back in India, really large-scale SMS messaging systems and all of that, I had a really good chat with one of their co-founders, and I had the opportunity to go work with them. But at the same time, I got an opportunity to go kind of be an associate at a venture capital firm, right? And I thought, great, like that is what I should do, because that is going to help me understand how things work, right? From the other side of the table. Like I didn't know head or tail about what is a term sheet, like, how does all of this work? And, that was an opportunity for me to learn. And the whole exercise in coming here to the US was to put myself outside my zone of comfort, right? It was, not to go deeper in the area that I was good at. It was to say that, if I truly wanted to, build a company, I needed to be a lot more rounded in my skills and abilities. And the only way I thought I was going to do that was by putting myself outside my zone of comfort. And, going and doing this job at a VC firm was something similar, right? Like I'm an engineer, like what did I know? But somehow, the partner there was impressed by me, and he wanted to kind of have me come spend the summer with them. And I did. And it was, again, something I really enjoyed doing, and I totally leaned on that partner's name and reputation and things like that, and opened doors with many companies, right? And just went and talked to the founders, and I was basically living my dream at that point, right? And so, at the end of it, they asked me to continue even once I came back to school. I did that for some time, but that was the time when I had already started working with the person who would eventually end up becoming my co-founder. I had joined his research group at Berkeley, and I did that because the project that he had started working on was related to behavior change in transportation, right? And this was early to mid 2010, right? And the whole thesis of that research was, can you influence people's behavior when it comes to decisions about transportation, right? Like, can you influence their behavior to say, you shouldn't drive as much, you should maybe take public transit a little bit more, and things like that, right? And so that was especially interesting to me because I was already studying human-computer interaction, and the behavior change and the psychological aspects of that, I felt I should kind of dig deeper into, right? And so I had joined that project, and I had started working with him, and that was also an extremely eye-opening experience for me because I got to read a lot about just transportation behavior in the US, and it was fascinating for me, for example, to learn that if you own a car in the US, you're spending on average $10,000 a year on that car, right? And my first year's salary at Infosys was like $3,500 or something, right? So like you really think about scale there. I'm like, oh my God, the cars have this outsized impact on people's lives here in the US. And I was kind of learning a lot more about cars and the role that it plays in people's lives, especially in this market. And that was also around the time when I bought my first car in the US. It was an awesome 1998 Honda Accord. And it was, when I got my first insurance quote, like $1,400 or something like that, right? And I was like, wait, that's my salary for a month. Right? I can't really afford to pay $1,400 for an insurance policy. And so I started digging into why. Like, why is it so expensive? How does the insurance industry work? That's when I figured out, wait a minute, they don't have my history. I just came to the country. So, they have no idea, how I drive. And so they have to kind of make these assumptions based on the car and the color of the car and my gender and random variables. And that's pretty much, the data that is available to the insurance industries. And that kind of started connecting things for me, because part of the core technology we had built at Berkeley as part of that research project was we wanted to understand how people behave first before we kind of intervened with changes to things that would hopefully change behavior, right? And so and the way we did that was smartphones were just taking off. It was 2010. A critical mass of people did have smartphones, and so our approach was to just install software on smartphones, collect all the sensor data in a battery efficient way, push it up into the cloud, and apply machine learning algorithms onto that and determine when were you driving versus walking, running, biking, different modes of transportation, right? So we had built technology which allowed us to do that. And as I was digging deeper into auto insurance and they don't even have data, and I started making the connection that, but wait a minute, like we have actually built technology which could provide that data, right? And there was already a movement in the auto insurance industry to do similar things, to collect data. And I was like, okay, there seems to be some opportunity here, right? And I've always believed that you shouldn't just go be an entrepreneur because entrepreneurship is the end goal, right? Like I think, at least in my opinion, that is not the right incentive. I think you should only work on something if you're ready to put in a good 6 to 10 years of your life into that, right? And that whole litmus test of, am I going to enjoy waking up in the morning and then going and working on this thing under really stressful conditions for like 6 years, like 7, 8 years, 10 years. And so this was something, I was doing as a poorly paid grad student, sheerly out of interest anyway. And I was definitely passionate about this. And I kind of formed this thesis in my head about how, initially Automatic was, about the auto insurance kind of opportunity, right? Where, because it is such a big industry, it's like almost $200 billion of premiums every year just in the US. I felt like there was this massive opportunity where the industry would shift towards using data to, price risk essentially, right? And so I was like, took my, teammate out to lunch, and I told him, look, I think there's an opportunity here, and I think we should do something about it, pursue it, think about starting a company. And he was like, sure, let's do it, right? And so started down that path. This was in late 2010, and luckily the last semester during my master's degree, I was pretty much done with my final project. That was a social enterprise that I had been building for most of my time at Berkeley. And I also had an interesting choice to make at that point, because that social enterprise called Next Drop, we had entered a bunch of business plan competitions, and we had won, and we ended up with almost $500,000, because I knew that if we were to really give that social enterprise a chance, it had to have money, right? And we had to have funding. So I was kind of focused on getting some money into that enterprise, and we had about $500,000 at that point. But then I really also wanted to kind of work on this opportunity. So I had a decision to make, right? Like, which one am I going to go pursue? I could kind of work on that social enterprise, and there was money there to pay myself a pretty good salary, because I would have to kind of go back to India and work on that and all that. But ultimately, I decided, yes, that's possibly the easier option, but I'm going to do what I came here to do in the first place, right? So I'm going to go do my greedy capitalist startup first, and I feel like I can do the social enterprise and have that impact further down the line, right? And so I set that aside, and there were other teammates who continued working on that over the next few years, and I focused my energies on automatic. And after that, we applied to Y Combinator. That year we got in. We went to Y Combinator in the summer of 2011. That was especially interesting because the batch that we applied to, it was in the previous batch. It was in the middle of the previous batch that they announced that, hey, every company would get $150,000, right? And so I was like, oh my God, like everybody and his uncle is now going to apply in our batch, which they kind of did. I think they got like the number of applications jumped significantly in our batch. But hey, like, I think we had a good story to tell, and we told it, and we got into Y Combinator. And so, but before I did that, so I kind of used all the relationships that I had built when I was working, in this VC firm, and I went to a number of Y Combinator alums, right, like founders who had been to Y Combinator earlier, and I basically told them, gave them the pitch, and said, please write to them and write to the partners at Y Combinator and tell them how awesome we are, right? And so I went and did that, first founder, second, third, fourth, fifth, and I was like, no stone unturned, right? Like, give it everything I have. But I think the seventh guy or eighth maybe told me, oh, if one alum recommends you, you get the interview, right? After that, like, it's up to you. Like, you either get in or not. I'm like, okay, why didn't the first guy tell me this? Like, then I would have saved myself a bunch of time. But the bottom line is, I was in that mindset of not, leaving any, thing to chance, right? And so, thankfully, it all worked out. We got in, and it was great. It was kind of a good experience to go through that program. It was stuff that I was kind of reading about when I was in India. So it was an interesting decision because I was also a student. I was on an F1 visa, right? I graduated, and I just decided to go do this company. And what most people don't know, especially is Indian students who come here, is that when you are on an F1 visa and you graduate, you don't have to rush to kind of try to get an H1B visa and all that, right? So there is something called the OPT that gives you, especially if you're in a STEM, science, technology, engineering, management kind of field, you get 29 months where you can basically do whatever you want, right? As long as you show that you have some, you're gainfully employed. And so I took that risk. I said, it was fine. Coming out of grad school, like most students, I was pretty much broke, right? Didn't have anything. But the one thing I did have was, I always asked myself, what's the worst that can happen, right? I felt I could always get a job, right? That was something that I felt fairly confident that getting a job is never going to be hard, right? So, if I don't, especially when I've found something that I am passionate about, if I don't do this now, then when, right? So I just, went ahead and dove right in. We rented an apartment in Mountain View. And of course, my co-founder was a grad student, same position as me, like borderline broke. And so basically the company paid the rent. And when I went to Safeway to buy food for ourselves, I paid with the company debit card. And even though we didn't have the money to pay ourselves a salary, but the company kind of paid for our living expenses. And that was how we got started, right? And it was during that time that I was also trying to sell to insurance companies, and it was not going well, right? Like, I was naive enough to believe that as three guys, another person had joined us at that point. Three guys in an apartment in Mountain View would walk into meetings with Fortune 50 insurance companies and convince them to kind of give us a big contract. Like it just doesn't work like that. And I was beginning to kind of worry about my ability to kind of actually get some of these deals done. And somewhere towards the end of Y Combinator, the demo day is coming up, and one of the things about Y Combinator is this pressure about, how much progress have you made, right? And ideally, every startup has on demo days, like there's a graph up and to the right, things are awesome, you should invest in us, right? Like that's the standard pitch, but we hadn't really made a lot of progress, right? And so I was like, at that point, okay, I need to solve this somehow, right? I need to get some customers, a pilot, something going. And I felt like one way to solve that problem was to get somebody who was from the industry, who had that reputation, who could help me sell. So I just tried to find advisors who could help me do that. And one of the people I kind of hustled my way into had founded a pretty well-known insurance company, and I told him, look, this is my pitch. Here's why I think we can go build a fantastic business. I'd love for you to be our advisor, blah, blah, blah. And then he came back to me a couple of days later and he's like, I love what you're doing so much that forget about an advisor. Like, I want to join you guys, right? And if you're willing to give me a serious stake in the business, I want to just come and join you guys, right? And so, we were like, interesting, like not what we were looking for. And I remember going and talking to Paul Graham, and his first thing to me was, terrible idea. This has all the makings of a disaster waiting to happen. Don't do it, right? And I was like, but I have zero chance of going and selling to these insurance companies myself. So Paul Graham, I know better than you. And so I went and did that. And I think you know where the story is going. It didn't end up really well, because right after demo day, we went and went on the rounds, Sand Hill Road, wanted to raise our seed round, met lots of VCs, me and this guy. And so we had quite a bit of interest, right? It was a good story. And finally, a couple of them had come very close. One of them was like, Thejo, like, we'll just take your seed round. We'll write you a check for $1 million. Monday is the partner meeting. We'll get it finalized then. It'll all be done. Great. And the Thursday before this Monday, this guy calls me and he's like, all right, Thejo, like, you make me the CEO now. Otherwise, I'm going to walk and I'm going to tell all the VCs that, this company can't succeed without me, and you guys are screwed. Right? I'm like, all right. Like, this was my first experience of the real world, right? Like, this is one of those moments where, I guess the hair grows in the chest, right? A boy becomes a man or whatever it is. And, thought about it and, went back and basically told him, look, this is not how you start a relationship, right? Like, I am not willing to do this. Obviously spoke to my co-founder and he was like, what is this weirdness, right? And so we essentially went back to him and said, won't work, right? I picked up the phone, talked to all the VCs, and I basically told them, look, this is happening, right? And either you still like us or you don't, but we are not going ahead with this because we don't think this is how you operate, right? Like, there's a certain ethics in how you, build a business, and, we don't think this is the right way to do it. And, not very secretly, I hoped that they wouldn't get scared, but the real world doesn't work like that. Everybody got scared, and like we had the stench of death to us, right? And all of them, went away. And so here I was, a month after demo day in Y Combinator, not a single dollar raised, and I am sitting in. Sitting at home. Home was the office, and I'm lying down in bed at night, like, fear in the pit of my stomach is like, we're screwed, right? We're done. And I have just started down this journey. I had all of these big dreams of starting a company, and here I am. I've stumbled and fallen even before we have gotten going, right? And so that was really hard. Like, we had a very limited amount of runway, and I had talked to pretty much like tons of investors, and there was no way I could go back to them now and say, oh, by the way, like, that guy that was there, like, he's no longer there, but you should give me money. Like, that wouldn't work. And but that was also one of the best things that happened to me and to the company in general, right? Because after that, I kind of, reset, brought the team together, and I said, let's go continue working on the product. And you guys do that. I'm going to go figure out what we're going to do from a funding perspective, right? And I kept at it, and we had started speaking with Andreessen Horowitz, obviously well-known VC, and I continued kind of having that dialogue with them, and ultimately, told them the story. And to make matters even more interesting, this guy kind of came at us a month later, and we got this long legal letter. It's like, hey, you owe me this, like all nonsense, but you owe me this, that, and the other. And if you don't disclose this to investors you're speaking with, it's illegal. And I'm like, okay, like I have one more thing hanging around my neck to go and deal with, right? And so, Andreessen Horowitz was like, wait, what happened? Like, you actually did that? Okay, now this is more attractive to us, right? Like, here you go, $100,000. And I'm like, okay, finally, 2.5 months after we got the demo day done, I was like, thought we were pretty much dead. But then Andreessen Horowitz came in, and they're a multi-billion-dollar fund, and for them $100,000 is not much, but they had faith, right? They believed in that, and they wrote that check. And so that got some momentum going, right? And then I started talking to more investors. I still didn't feel we had a strong enough story to go kind of get our entire round of $1 million or whatever done. And so I was still working on it. And then I remember, at the same time, I had started talking to the guys from Founders Fund, right? And another really good fund. And I distinctly remember when I was in the process of raising that round, I went back into the market because I had some momentum and story to tell everybody. And as I was having those meetings, one fine day, this was almost 3 months in November of 2011 or something like that, Founders Fund, those guys came back to me, and they said, hey, we'd like to put in some money in your company. I was like, great, right? But I felt like because I really wanted the money from Andreessen Horowitz, I'd given them like a really good deal. And I'm like, I just need some investor, right? But I felt like I didn't want to go raise my entire seed round at that valuation. And so what I basically told the guys from Founders Fund is, guys, you should give me, yes, I just closed this round at this cap like 2 weeks ago, but you should give me almost double of that. And they were like, are you crazy? Like, why would I do that? Right? And that's one of the lessons, and that's the point here, is that one of the lessons is that in life you never get anything if you don't ask for it. And and that is something I've truly believed in. And now I don't hesitate to ask for things which might seem crazy, right? Because if you don't ask, you're not going to get it. And I felt like the same thing, the risk-averse thing to do in that situation might have been just give it, like just whatever it is, just give it. But I told them, no. Just 2 weeks ago, I gave these guys this valuation, but I think 2 weeks later, my business is all of a sudden like worth 2 times more, right? And they were like, you're insane. Like, why the hell? But the case I made to them was, look, guys, a cap of like a valuation of like $7 million, that's nothing to you. That's like the $100,000 you're investing in us is like just a rounding error in your larger fund, right? It doesn't make sense, to you, but it will to me, right? In terms of what I tell the remaining investors are going to come in and put the money into the rest of the round. If you invest at this higher valuation, I can use that as the benchmark and kind of get the rest of the money at that valuation. It'll really help us out, right? Like, you're not going to give up a lot, but and I made that case to them, and they were like, fine, right? They actually gave it to me, and but they, it was Scott Nolan, I think, who's still there, and he basically said, but I want you to promise me one thing. Okay, what is that? When you're raising your next round of funding, I need to be your first call. I'm like, okay, promised, right? And so they gave that, and now we went from this company which was just pretty much dead, right? It was, had the stench of death about it, like all kinds of things had gone wrong. We went from there, but from an outside perspective, now we were this company. We had 3 investors, Y Combinator, Andreessen Horowitz, and Founders Fund, right? And suddenly, that was the time I felt to capitalize on the business. So we just went on AngelList, And obviously at that point, like nobody knows the true story of just how close we were to dying, right? So at that point, it's like, hey, we're raising money now, and our investors are Y Combinator and Andreessen Horowitz Founders Fund, and then like boom, like we were at the top of the leaderboard on angel list for like the next 2 weeks or something like that, and we got our round done in 2 weeks. I wanted to raise $1 million, but there was so much demand that we ended up raising $1.5 million. And this is just to show that even in the very worst of times, it's important to kind of not completely give up hope, right? Because that was something I had told myself that I'm not going to give up. And in all of my reading of the technology history that I mentioned and the experiences of others and the learning from others' experiences, a common pattern and theme I had taken away was just perseverance, right? It's that is kind of a hallmark feature of the very successful entrepreneurs is they don't give up that easily, right? And so something I had taken away was just don't give up, right? Of course, there is a difference between banging your head against a rock and you have to know when to give up, but if there is even a chance, because the fundamental story and the fundamental thesis of the business that we were building was sound, right? And there was that opportunity there, and there was zero chance I was going to give up for some stupid reason like this, right? And so, we got past it, and we ended up raising that seed round of funding. And during that time, I had also, it was almost like more than a year at that time since we had decided to start the company. I had decided that, this whole thing about us going and just selling directly to insurance companies is not going to work, right? We're just going to die. And I had decided by that time that, we should actually go after a broader, larger, bigger, better opportunity, which was kind of becoming that platform for, data processing for all connected cars and all applications in the larger automotive ecosystem, right? So the thesis was simple, is that the car is the most expensive computer we own. Yes, there is a need for data to do a better job in the auto insurance industry, but there is a similar need in every part of the automotive ecosystem, right? But there is no way to kind of get data out of that car, push it up into the cloud, process it, and show a monetization model. And I felt like there was this larger opportunity to kind of do that. I felt like that would become a necessity as every car got connected. And of course, back then, the automotive industry was not something that the Silicon Valley really looked at. Like VCs didn't want to invest in automotive companies, right? Because for good reasons, like long sales cycles and difficult to work with industry, all of that. And but of course, now the situation is a little different. Like automotive industry is something that's really hot in Silicon Valley. But I still decided, wait, this is going to happen, right? This will absolutely happen in the next few years, and we have that opportunity to go build something valuable here. And so we decided, but how do we get the data out, right? And we felt like the right go-to-market strategy for us would be to focus on not just data from the smartphone, because there's a whole saying about go where the puck is going, right? Because if you only rely on the smartphone, you're not going to get any value from the data in the car itself, right? So, the real value is in having access to the data in the car. But how do you get that, right? Like there aren't APIs, like there are 250 million cars on the roads. So we decided, okay, we're going to make hardware, right? So it's one of those things where, what they say about entrepreneurs, right? Like if you knew how difficult it would be, you wouldn't have started it in the first place. Like our decision to go make hardware was one of those, like absolutely, right? Like if I had known how difficult it is going to be to kind of make and ship a hardware product at scale, probably wouldn't have done it, but have no regrets now that we actually ended up doing that. And it was fun because I closed that round in December of 2011, made that decision soon after. In January, I got back to all the investors and said, hey, you just last month you invested in this company that basically my pitch to you was we make software on smartphones, but guess what? Now we're making hardware. And, they were, thankfully, nobody kind of, yelled at me and asked for their money back because I was careful enough to kind of put a very, nice thesis together and wrote a nice document and said, before you come back to me, read this, right? And they read it, and they thought it made sense, and they gave me the thumbs up and said, just go do your thing, and we did, right? And there was a very interesting journey in us building that hardware device, taking it to market, shipping it. Maybe one thing that I should talk about, because I feel like there's a useful lesson there, is how we ended up selling that product in the Apple stores, right? So as we were building that product, ultimately the goal for us was, yes, we're going to sell this to consumers, right? And any consumer product, the holy grail is if it meets that bar of being carried in the Apple stores, that's special, right? Like Apple's attention to detail and focus on product quality kind of rubs off on you in terms of reputation, right? And so that was clearly somewhere as a goal, right? Like we want to build a product that we can probably or hopefully we can sell in the Apple store. But I had no idea how that would happen and how that would ultimately go from a wish to actual reality, right? But anyway, we just made sure that we held ourselves to that standard in everything we did, and we just went about the process. But as we were doing it, I started working on the manufacturing, supply chain, logistics. Like, how do we actually make this thing in Asia, get it all the way back to the US? There's a whole set of things that has to be taken care of, and we were going through kind of this competitive process where we were working with a few vendors, and one of them, because he wanted to kind of impress us and make us feel like they were the ones who could really add value, he basically told me, hey, I think you guys are building a cool product. I know the buyer at Apple, right? Like, for those of you who are not familiar with retail, they have buyers who basically make the decision on what do you carry in the stores and things like that, right? And so I know the buyer, right? Would you like an introduction? I was like, sure, like I'd love an introduction. And this was at a point where we barely had the product, right? And, but then I took the meeting, and what we did have was really nice high fidelity mock-ups of the product. It was a PowerPoint pitch, right? Yes, we were building it, but from a software perspective, it was a PowerPoint deck. But from the actual hardware perspective, what we had done by then, because I wanted a tool to kind of talk about what we were doing. So we had created essentially a 3D printed device that we were going to manufacture, and it was one of those existed in the world, right? So there was a device that was hand painted, and inside there were no electronics. Just to give it some weight, there was like a heavy metal washer or something like that. And so that was the thing that I was showing people, and I was telling them, like, this is the thing that we're going to manufacture at scale, right? And so I take this thing to the buyer in Apple, and I paint this vision of, look, this is what the product does, and here's the problem we're trying to solve, and cars aren't connected, and that is a whole new category. I think every car should be connected because you have all of these benefits if they are, and this is the device is going to be, and he kind of got the idea that, oh, this thing is done, right? And this is awesome. And he loved that concept, and he's like, great, when can we carry it in the stores? That I was not ready for, right? And I was like, okay, like, give me some time, right? And so then the job was for me to kind of hold him back for the duration when we would be ready to kind of actually ship a product. And that could have totally backfired, right? So I guess the learning there for me also was, there are other startups which have done that, right? Something similar where they promise big things, in public, but then they can't really live up to it, and they crash and burn. And that has happened way too many times over the last few years. And there was absolutely the risk that could have happened, but I was only comfortable kind of telling that story in public and telling people that, or at least giving them the impression that we were further along than we actually were, because I felt like we had all the risks under control, because I felt like we would actually go ahead and manufacture this. We had the team which had the expertise, we had a plan, and yes, it was months away, but I felt pretty confident that we could and would actually do it, right? And at the end of the day, a company or a product or whatever else it is that you end up building, it is nothing but the sum total of the judgment that the team that builds it brings to the table, right? And if over and over again, if you show good judgment and the team shows good judgment, then you build something successful. But then if you show poor judgment, you don't, right? Like, those companies fail. And so I think what worked for us was that that judgment was sound ultimately, at least it was proven to be, right? That over-promising a little bit when we weren't really ready was the right thing at that stage of the company, right? And so really thinking deeply, and I did that, and I think it was worth taking that risk, because being in the Apple stores, like, it changed a lot for us, right? So that whole go-to-market strategy of, hey, we can't go straight and sell to the insurance companies. We have to have a big differentiator against the existing enterprise companies. We are in the Apple store. Like, saying that was a great differentiator, right? Like, that is how we add value. You're not just you're sending a hardware device to your customers and scaring them about the privacy issues of their auto insurance company, like sucking all of their data, like that. You don't have to worry about that, right? You can give them a product that the very best stores in the world are carrying, Apple. And then we got into Best Buy and all the other places. And so that opened the door, even as a smaller company, for us to kind of have these very serious conversations with these much larger companies who would otherwise not even have looked at us, right? And so, of course, it complicated the business in lots of ways, because we had a consumer product that we were selling, but then we also went in, got a bunch of deals done with larger insurance companies, and there was always this tug of war between the consumer effort and the enterprise effort, and all of that. But it was still worth it. At the end of the day, it worked out. So we did that, launched in 2013, and there are many other lessons along the way. Like, it wasn't just the one time that we came very close to death, right? Like, it happened again. I remember us having 2 weeks of runway before I closed my Series B, right? And if for some reason it took longer after we signed the term sheet to us actually closing, and if the money had not come in, if it had come in like 2 weeks later or something, we would have been out of money. Like, there were 35 people in the company, and like families I was responsible for, and that was a scary moment. And there are lots of moments like that, and as all of the entrepreneurs here will tell you, that is the reality of building a company, right? Like, very rarely do you experience a startup where everything just goes up and to the right and everything is great, and from founding to exit, awesome, right? Like, it is almost never like that. And we came very close to death many times, and I persevered, the team persevered, and I got to work with a really smart group of people, and we kept at it, right? And we kept, and another takeaway is that, yes, all of that applies when I said, you want to get up in the morning and want to work on it and all that, but realize that it is a grind sometimes, right? It is a grind that doesn't end for weeks at a time, months at a time, sometimes like years at a time, and that's where the perseverance part comes in, right? So you might be enjoying the larger, vision of the company and the things that you're building and all of that, but when you're in the weeds on a day-to-day basis, it can be a grind, right? It can be challenging, it can be stressful, and that's not always enjoyable, but that is part of the journey, right? That is the price you pay, and so ultimately, like BJ said, I came to the US in 2009, and spent a couple of years, got the master's, started the company, And I'm really thankful that the journey worked out. And I also shouldn't stand here and kind of claim that it was only because of somehow my brilliance or my team's brilliance or whatever it is, right? Like there was a big dollop of luck there, and I can't even count the number of times where luck probably went our way, right? Once, one example that jumps to mind is, again, in the very early days of the company, right? When I was raising my seed round, there was this one person, like, his name is Alex Kine. He's out in London, and I met him through AngelList, and after like a couple of hour-long phone calls, he just says, I love what you're doing. How much can I invest in your company, right? And ultimately ended up investing one guy, $400,000, right? And if I had missed him, for example, right, and by a couple of weeks, either way, he's a busy guy, like a really successful guy in his own right, running his own company and all that, and he was traveling. Something, he was not available when I was raising money. That might have made the difference between me having enough capital to build a hardware device or not, right? And that's just one example of many such examples, and you really need a whole lot of luck, to go your way. And it's really, I think, easy to kind of convince yourself that whatever happened was purely because of your smartness or brilliance or whatever it is, and it isn't, right? Like there is a lot more to it than that, and we were lucky to have that on our side, and things worked out at the end of the day. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to kind of answer any questions that you guys might have. And Vijay, was there anything else that you wanted to do?
No, I think this was fantastic, Thejo. Thank you so much, and particularly because you shared your story from the very beginning, right? I mean, a lot of people just think that entrepreneurs drop from the sky and they create so much value. So I think it was very interesting to hear about your early days, etc. But I think probably the audience wants to know a little bit more about Automatic.
Sure.
And so, and by the way, one of the things I know you said that a lot of these things sort of happened where this guy found you an AngelList, invested $400K, or somebody else introduced you to the Apple buyer, etc. So I don't think this is just good fortune, because like I read a quote a long time ago where, especially for entrepreneurship, it says you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Which means if you're not there actively looking to do stuff, there's no way in hell you'd find that.
I think Andy Grove puts it really well in the context of entrepreneurship, where he calls it earned luck, right?
Absolutely.
So it's luck, but you have to earn it, right? You have to be at the right place at the right time, and you have to put in your time, and and then you earn that luck, right? And so it's not like you're winning a lottery, right? Like that's not how it works. But as you're going through that process and you're working hard and you're persevering, sometimes you earn the luck that you get, right?
Correct. So I, even in my own journey, I did, I kind of overlooked to say, in my day job, I run a company called July Systems. But it's just, I've been an entrepreneur for many, a couple of decades here, much senior to Thejo here, who's a young man. But you have to actively get out there and do stuff. And then, only then, the good things will happen. It's like you cannot just sit back in your armchair and say, I'll be an entrepreneur, armchair entrepreneur, and then all these good fortune's going to happen to me. So the fact that you went and interned at a VC firm, the fact you did all that stuff, Y Combinator, all of that effort has paid off. And so I just don't want to trivialize that and say, hey, this is just
absolutely not, right? Like
it is earned.
I will forever miss my black hair, and I had a head full of black hair when I started the journey, but now I don't, right? And my wife misses it even more than me. But it is exactly that sort of stuff that you have to give up, right?
And if you do it long enough, you have no hair. At least you have gray hair. My hair is almost gone.
Exactly.
So, anyways, so I think with that, I'd like to open it up to the audience. And yes, please.
Hi, my name is Brukant Popat. So congratulations on your success. Absolutely fantastic and inspiring story. It's awesome.
Thank you.
So I am starting on this journey of entrepreneurship, and I had one question is, how did you hire your first engineer? That is what I wanted to know.
So that's a great question, and that is always something that is a challenge in the early days, right? And what I found, was really worked for us is pretty much our entire initial team. And this answer also varies a little bit, if you're a first-time founder versus you've actually done something and you have a track record under your belt, because I'm doing something again, and this time the experience has been different than the first time. And the first time, it is always a challenge because you don't have a track record, you don't have a reputation. What you have is like, you're talking, right? You're saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and it is much harder to convince people that you are for real, because you haven't done anything and you can't show anything, right? And so in that situation, I think what works best is the people you know best, right? So the very first person who joined my co-founder and me was my co-founder's best friend, right? In his undergrad years. And there is no way he would have done it if he didn't have that strong relationship with my co-founder and trust in my co-founder, right? Where he knew my co-founder was a really smart guy, and they had that really close friendship. There is zero chance that he would have taken like a 2/3 salary cut and come and joined us and started on that journey. But that relationship was absolutely essential. And the second person who joined us after that was my roommate's best friend. Right, like I had a roommate when I was in Berkeley for like a couple of years, and I had met him through my roommate, and we knew each other. And he also wanted to kind of start a company, and the opportunity to come be a part of something very early stage was attractive to him. But those fears, were really addressed by my roommate, who basically told him like, okay, Thejo's the guy you can work with, right? You can trust him, and he's not an asshole and things like that, right? And so, and then the third person to join us was somebody I had worked on on multiple projects in grad school. Like, he was a year ahead of me, and so. Again, I go back to memory, right? Like, number 6 was again somebody I had worked with for a long time. Number 7 was somebody who was in our research group in Berkeley. So like the initial team completely was people in that circle, and that is the easiest way to convince people, because if you can't even convince the people who know you best, what chance do you have of convincing total strangers to come take that big chance on you and take massive salary cuts or take no salary and just take some equity which could very well be worthless. And so I think your chances are way, way higher if you kind of focus on the people in your close network.
Thejo, very inspiring story. I think I can connect with many aspects of it as I run an early stage education company. So one thing, I mean, we raised a little bit money earlier this year, but now we are getting ready to raise a new round. One challenge which I face is that with the small team, fundraising is a full-time job. So whether to focus on selling in the product and on fundraising, and how do you really navigate through this?
Yeah, again, great question. And my experience as a CEO, and in the early days, I was also a fully contributing engineer on the team, right? I was building a lot of the code, I was building the product, and my routine was something like this. Yes, looking back now, can I go back and live that lifestyle? Like, probably not. Like, I'm married now and all that, right? But back then, my lifestyle basically was I went into work, again, engineer, so I start the day late, went into work at about 11 or something, and most of the day I didn't really get to do productive coding kind of work, because as CEO, you have like, you're meeting potential investors, you're meeting people you're selling to, you're trying to hire people, and there's a bunch of those things happening. So the entire day spent doing that, and all of my coding, I come back home, eat something, and then from 8:30 p.m. to 1 a.m., 2 a.m., like 3 a.m., that's when I sit and build stuff, right? And so essentially that was my life. And maybe I have strong opinions about this, but at least I haven't figured out how to make work-life balance happen at those very early stages of a startup, right? Especially when you are so resource constrained. And maybe if you're a founder who has all of the resources, you can just raise a bunch of money even before you start building anything, and then you can pay people good salaries, and you can find the work-life balance. But when you're literally starting with nothing and you have nothing, then how do you find work-life balance other than just doing everything on your own, right? So that was my life for the good first 2 years of Automatic, right? And I got paid the grand sum of zero for like a big chunk of that time. But I loved it, right? Like there was nothing else I would do anyway. It was a lot of fun. It was challenging, and but I don't know if that's a helpful answer where I'm telling you sleep less and, and work more. But that was ultimately you have so many hours in the day, but you have X number of things to get done, and you just figure out a way to get it done, right? Like that was pretty much my experience.
Hi, I'm Vinay. I run an industrial IoT company, Series A. So my question is really on the growth stage a little bit. As you looked at going from Series A to Series B, and you have had an exit as well, it's always that thing, you have a product market fit, but you don't necessarily know exactly what the market is going to evolve to when you're in an emerging area like that.
Yep.
So how did you navigate that part of your journey? I know this is a little bit later, but if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, so in our case, maybe this is a time I can talk a little bit about Automatic, right? And so ultimately our vision, which I spoke a little bit about it when I talked about why we decided to make hardware, but the ultimate vision for Automatic always was that if you look at how the automotive industry is evolving, right? You have all of these car makers, and everybody believes, rightly so, that there is a lot of value in the data that is in the car, right? There is, the larger automotive ecosystem is about $2 trillion, just in the US, and a lot of money flowing in that ecosystem. And the impact that data can have on how business is done, in the entire ecosystem is like profound, right? Like this is, imagine before the financial industry got connected, right? And when everybody was doing things on paper and ledgers and things like that, but suddenly it got connected and networked, and everybody could exchange data. Like fundamentally, financial services, underwent a huge transformation, right? And so something similar when cars all get connected and networked and start talking to each other, that the entire notion of that industry is changing, will change as we move into the future. And so, my kind of vision was that there is zero chance, how much ever the car companies want it, the approach that they are taking is that everybody is building their own walled garden, right? Like everybody's saying, oh, you want data from my cars? I'm going to build a proprietary platform. You come and build an application on my platform, right? And so that is just hard when you have like 24 kind of car makers, right? Because there is zero chance that the rest of the world is going to come and build integrations with like every single proprietary platform that multiple cars build. So my thinking has always been that something similar to what happened in the financial services space is going to happen in the automotive space. Is look at what happened in the financial services space. Inevitably, once it got networked, you got these entities like Visa and MasterCard, and you got these interchanges or nodes in the network, which kind of sat in the network and helped exchange both money and data, right? And there was no chance every bank could talk to every other bank, and basically all of the entities of that larger ecosystem just couldn't talk to each other efficiently, right? So you needed those nodes, and my hypothesis is that something like that will happen in the automotive industry, where you are going to have the Visas or the MasterCards, where data from cars is going to flow into these exchanges, and there are going to be efficient ways for the rest of the ecosystem to consume that data. And that was kind of the technology platform that we were building. And ultimately for us, product market fit, it's elusive to kind of define, especially in a nascent space, right? And I still don't know if we had like strong product market fit with Automatic, and it's even harder to kind of define when your sales cycles are like 18 months and 20 months and like these mega deals with large companies and all that, right? And so but the approach we took was to build out that core technology platform and to answer the question of how do you get the data into the platform? How do you process it? How do you expose APIs that allows everybody to come and build against the platform, and then hopefully finally show how the data can be monetized, right? So that is what we were focusing on, and we did that. There were like 50 different verticals in the larger automotive industry where you could do that, but we just focused on one or two, right? And so, maybe that helped us in that we didn't try to do everything. Sometimes I feel even the things that we were doing was too much, but ultimately there was a lot more that we didn't do, right? So we really focused on the things where we felt we could sustainably kind of continue to build the business and grow revenues and show that as an independent business we were attractive enough, but at the same time we were keeping an eye on that the larger picture and the bigger price, right? And so that is how kind of we took that approach and made sure that when I told the story, be it to a potential investor or an acquirer or whatever it might be, we could connect the dots, right? Saying that, look, here's how we are an attractive business on our own today, but then here's how what we are doing lines up and the technology we have built lines up against that big, hairy, audacious goal, well into the future. And the reason ultimately that SiriusXM also bought us was it was pretty apparent that our technology, given with their relationships with all the car makers and the fact that they're already built into 80% of all cars sold in the US and all that, would really allow them to kind of get there a lot more successfully. Like the jury is still out, the deal hasn't, it's still early. Hopefully, they don't screw it up, but we'll see how it plays.
How did you know that your idea for Automatic was worth executing? Especially if you had other ideas, then how did you pick this idea over the others?
Again, good question, and there is no scientific answer to that, or at least I don't know if there's a scientific answer to that, right? So it is a mix of some analytical rigor versus ultimately gut feel, right? And so and the same thing applies to this new company that I'm building. But let me tell you my experience as an entrepreneur and how I've kind of approached it, right? Yes, there were other ideas that I had in addition to Automatic, and I was kind of looking into them simultaneously, but I ultimately chose to go with Automatic. And it essentially for me comes down to a few things, right? One is I don't believe that, or at least I believe it is very hard when you're trying to build a technology company to create waves, right? I think it's much easier to ride waves that are already being created, because when you're trying to build a startup, everything is so hard, right? And the last thing you want to do is try to create a brand new market from scratch, or create something that doesn't exist, or will a new market segment into existence. That takes more capital. It's just way harder. It takes longer, and when you're building a business, you want it to be efficient, right? Like how do you kind of efficiently get from point A to point B and hopefully get to an exit, and that's the goal, right? So the way I approach things when I get an idea is I try to first really focus on, does this really solve a problem for somebody, right? Like is there a large enough opportunity and an important enough pain point that somebody will actually buy and pay good money for, right? And so that's obviously an important criteria if you're trying to build a business. And so really try to hone into the problem that you are trying to solve, and don't kid yourself into believing that yes, the problem is bigger than it actually is, right? Because that is one of the biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make, is that deluding themselves into thinking that the problem they are solving is actually a problem, and not seeking very honest, open, critical feedback about just how big a pain point is it that you are solving, right? So that's one. And if you are solving a really important pain point, then there are these other aspects of, is it a large enough market? And in some cases, it might not be a large enough market today, right? But is it growing into a large enough market over time, right? That's important, because if you really want to build a business that scales in revenues into the tens of millions of dollars or whatever, it's very easy to make that calculation saying, hey, $100 billion business, if only I get 1%. Like that is like the very classic mistake that first time founders make, right? And it usually doesn't work like that. So asking the question about market size today, again, is it a wave that is in your favor or against you, right? Is the market shrinking, growing? Think about that. And ultimately for me, the way it has always worked is there are ideas where as you dig deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of trying to understand the pain, trying to understand the size of the market, and then talking to people who are actually experiencing the pain, understanding competition, how competitive is the market, what is your unique angle going to be, how would you approach this? Like as you kind of dig, peel it layer by layer by layer, sometimes you hit a wall, right? You're like, okay, this is too big a problem. Like you can't really get past this. And, but some ideas, you just keep going and going and going. You don't hit bottom, right? And so that's when, with Automatic, it was like that for me. With this new company that I'm working on, it was like that. And when you kind of get that feeling that, okay, I'm not hitting bottom on this, and I've already spent a couple of months really looking at it from every possible angle, then it starts to feel a lot more real, right? And then you can always, of course, go talk to people and have people poke holes at it from various angles, right? Like, and one of the things that I always did when I was building Automatic was I had a board, obviously, right? That for the company, but I also had what I called to myself the kick-ass board, right? Not because, of course, they were great people and they were kick-ass, but their job was to kick my ass, right? Like I went and sat and said, I'm going to tell you what assumptions I am making, and your sole job is to kind of tear it down, right? Your job is to kind of tell me why I'm an idiot and tell me why something is not working, and show me my blind spots. And you should never be afraid to do that, right? Because it doesn't cost you anything to get that kind of feedback. They might be completely wrong. And there are moments when, I asked for that feedback and I got very strong feedback that I immediately dismissed because I was like, no, this is invalid, right? Like my thinking is still sound. And but you should always seek that feedback from as many smart people as you can find. And that is how you triangulate into that, okay, there is a kernel of an idea here, and I should go work on it, right?
Just a small rejoinder. So basically you're saying like explore some multiple ideas in parallel in the very beginning stages, and then some of them you will kind of prune and others will continue.
Absolutely, right? And so again, there's no point in doing it serially, right? Like, there are so many opportunities in the world. The opportunities I feel are endless. So why limit yourself to just doing it serially? Just, find things that you're passionate about naturally, things that you would enjoy working on, pick areas like that, dig, go deeper and deeper into multiple layers. And for me, because I'm like a natural student of startups and building businesses and things like that, right? So, I have Evernote documents where I'm always jotting down notes and ideas. And this new company that I'm working on, Airbase, it started off as an idea in Evernote. As I was building Automatic, I was like, why is this such a pain, right? Like, why doesn't any product exist to make this better? And, but after Automatic is sold and I had the time and all that, as I dug deeper and deeper, it was not just that one idea, there were others too. That's something I just do is whenever I think of something, I write it down, note it down, and I might not have the time to kind of really dig into it then, but I might 2 years from now if nobody else has solved the problem, right? And so, and by the way, that's something I do across the board, right? And because if you're building a company, you need to build a team, right? You need to hire, if the company ends up doing well, lots and lots of people, right? Some people that I hired at Automatic, they had started off as an entry in my Evernote document 6 years before, 7 years before. I met this smart person and maybe I can work with them someday, right? Because your job as a founder is to keep hiring. At some point it becomes hiring like 50, 60, 70% of your time. And if you naturally as a habit, you are always keeping track of every smart person you have met, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, you might be looking for a specific person with a specific skill set. You go look at your list and you go talk to them and find out if they're available. If you're lucky, things will match. And it's the same with ideas, right? And it's not okay, I'm going to go sit down now and good ideas will come to me. Like, it doesn't work like that.
Great. Well, Thejo, thank you so much. I think one unique aspect of your My Story talk today, we do this quite frequently. We have a lot of guests on this program, is that you actually said it the way it is. Most people just gloss over all the sort of hard journey part and just talk about, all the cool stuff. But I think, really, I think it's more than just good ideas. What I personally am taking away is that even sort of a young entrepreneur like Thejo, if you just look at the tenacity and if you just look at how hard he has been going at each and every aspect of this, right? Whether it's fundraising, whether it's finding team members, whether it's finding customers, whether it's finding an exit, it's just, you have to be tenacious and you have to really put in the effort to do that. And so you could take any idea you want and, again, I know you're probably in stealth, but what he's doing with his new company, Airbase, has got nothing to do with anything he has talked about all evening. This has got to in a completely different sector. So it's just everybody has great ideas, but execution and how you go about executing, I think that's really the key takeaway, at least for me. And thank you so much, Thejo.
Thank you.
Really, really wonderful talk.
Thank you.